Hi guys, and welcome to video 3 in the playlist iteration. Let's jump in right at the deep end with the purpose of this particular video, which is for you to understand the types of iteration, in other words loops, in programming and their purpose. So we have three types. We have the while loop, the do until loop, and a type of loop that we call count controlled loops. For you to understand the role of the true or false condition in the functioning of a Python loop. In this video, guys, I'm not doing any Python demos. It was my intention to do so, but each time I did that, the runtime of this video got to be about 45 or 50 minutes, which is far too long for you guys to want to be watching a video. So I've taken out the Python demos. They're going to feature in the next video. This one is going to be just dedicated to what you need to know by way of awareness for your OCR GCSE computer science course. Okay, as is always the case, guys, the Python Monster resources are there for you to use. So that's the videos and the texts, and also you may find those useful for your revision as well. So let's start off with some ideas about what iteration is and why it's useful. So I'm not going to read this slide out, guys, okay, because I'll bore you to death with going through all of those 5 bullet points. So if you want to pause the video and read these for yourself, you're more than welcome to do so. What I will say, though, is one of the best examples of why iteration is so useful and necessary in programming is to imagine that you had to work with a series of numbers. Okay, so let's say 1 to 100, for example. Now imagine that as part of your program, you needed to print each number as you work through the sequence of your algorithm or your code. Now you'd literally, the worst case scenario actually is that you would literally need to write 100 separate lines of code to print all of those numbers. So that's one line of code that says print 1, another line of code that says print 2, all the way up to your final line of code which says print 100. Now if that sounds really crazy, then absolutely it is, but there's probably no better or simpler example of why iteration is really crucial as a tool to be able to use in programming. And just like the if-else statements, programming just would not be practical to do without the ability to iterate in your algorithms, and hence being able to iterate in the solutions in your code as well, in your Python code. Okay guys, so let's cover off what you need to know by way of awareness and some technical terms for the OCR version of the computer science GCSE. Now all of the other examples are the same. Okay, they all have technical terms you need to learn, but I want to make sure that you have got the OCR terms fixed, so you know what you need to know for your exams. Okay, so what OCR have done is they've divided or grouped the 3 types of loops into 2 groups. Okay, so on the left hand side we have a type of loop called the, let me just get my box out, okay, the count controlled loop. Okay, now the count controlled loop is what most people refer to as the for loop, okay, for obvious reasons that you can see on the slide. So there's only one type of count controlled loop. Now the other loops, there are 2 of these which you need to be aware of. Okay, they are called the condition controlled loops, one of which is called the while loop and one of which is called the do until loop. Okay, so before I go any further, let me just undo these boxes. Okay, here are the OCR terms. Okay, so we've got count controlled loop and condition controlled loops. Okay, so you can see how they're grouped up on the slide, but I think it's useful for you to be aware of the fact that not all authors and websites and textbooks refer to these loops in the same way. And last time I looked, I think the BBC Bitesize was included amongst authors and sites that refer to count controlled loops as definite iteration. Okay, so I've just popped that term there in brackets. And also they refer to condition controlled loops, so that's the while loop and the do until loop, as indefinite iteration. So it's not my intention to mention this to confuse you, quite the opposite. What I want to make sure is that if you go onto a website and you see the term definite or indefinite iteration, you will know what they actually refer to in terms of your OCR technical terms, and you don't get confused and think maybe these are completely different things, because they're actually the same. Okay, just like with the data type, the float and the real, right, it's 2 different names being applied to the same thing. Okay, so in the bigger wider world, count controlled loops are also referred to as definite iteration, and condition controlled loops can also be referred to as indefinite iteration as well. So those are the alternative terms you may come across. Okay guys, let's just get rid of these boxes for a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just cover off some commonalities between these different loops. Okay, so just as is the case with the if-else statement, with loops and iteration there is a condition that needs to be evaluated as either true or false. Doesn't matter what type of iteration you are looking at, or whatever it's termed in a book or in programming languages, an iteration must have a condition to be evaluated as either true or false. And you will have seen that concept before with the if-else statements and other examples of programming as well. So if we take the count controlled loop on the left hand side, this one, okay, it's a very simple example of a loop. Where do you think the evaluation needs to occur? So where is the condition in those 3 lines of code where evaluation needs to be done? Well, the answer, guys, is this bit here. And just like an if statement, the evaluation or the condition occurs right at the top of the block of code. Okay, so iteration includes blocks of code just like if-else constructs do as well. So here is the condition that needs to be evaluated. So what is it that we're actually asking? What's the question that we're asking here? So the question we're actually asking is the number less than 9? That's the question which results in an evaluation which will be true or false. How that works is that in a count controlled loop, the number, okay, so the number, which is the variable that's used to store the count, is incremented automatically by Python. So each time we iterate through this loop, number is incremented by 1. In which case we can ask the question, has number yet got to 9? Okay, so the question we're asking is number less than 9? If the answer to that question is yes, then the loop continues to iterate. If the answer to that question is no, then iteration stops. So what happens when number eventually gets to 9 in this loop? Okay, so in this loop, what happens when number gets to 9? The condition is no longer true, it's actually false, because the number is no longer less than 9, it's actually equal to 9. So what that basically means is that iteration stops. Now this is a peculiarity of Python. What I'm describing to you here is a peculiarity of Python. So if we are asking the question, is number less than 9? Okay, what are we actually going to get printed if we ran this code in Python, do you think? What's going to be printed out? The answer to the question is that Python would print out 0 to 8 inclusive, but not 9. And the reason for that is because in this condition here, we're asking the question, is number less than 9? So in Python, when we put together this type of syntax, Python will increment the number from 0 to 9, not inclusive of 9. Okay, so 0 to 9, not inclusive. In other words, it stops at the point where it's evaluated 8 and then doesn't go any further. Okay, so we'll come back to this type of quirkiness with Python in some of the demos, okay, in future videos. But I wanted to explain to you how the evaluation works and the way that Python tends to work with count controlled loops. So let's move across then to the while loop. So here's our block of code for the while loop. You may recognize this actually because the pseudocode on the slide is actually describing a very similar program to the one that we did in the last video. Okay, what we're saying is while the user does not input quit, then iterate, ask the user continually to input a number until the user inputs the word quit. Okay, and then iteration stops. So where in this particular type of loop, guys, is the evaluation? Okay, where is the condition that needs to be evaluated? And the answer to that question is just like with the for loop or the count controlled loop at the top. Okay, with the while loop, the condition that we need to evaluate is also right at the top of the block of code. So what we're saying with the while loop is whilst the input from the user does not equal quit, okay, then continue to iterate. Iteration, okay, includes these lines of code here. So we ask the user for yet another number. We increment total, Okay, so that total is our running total of all of the numbers that have been input by the user. As soon as the user inputs quit, okay, then iteration stops. So these lines of code here are no longer executed. So that, guys, leaves us with the last example of what OCR refers to as a condition controlled loop, which is the do until loop. Okay, now these types of loops come in a variety of different names. OCR refers to them as do until loops. Okay, so that's the technical term that you need to remember for this type of loop. However, if you read around the subject of iteration on websites and in books, you will very often find that the do until loop is referred to by a different name, and there are loads of them, guys. Okay, the do while loop, okay, the repeat until loop, okay, is just two of them. All right, so again, I don't want you to get confused, because if you see on a website or in a book that iteration and these types of loops are referred to by a different name, it's basically the same type of loop, it's just given a different name. Okay, so guys, if you look at this bottom example of a condition controlled loop, what is it that's different about this type of loop from the other type of condition controlled loop? What can you see is different, okay, between those two? Well, the answer actually is that with a do until loop, the condition that needs to be evaluated occurs at the bottom of the block of code. Now that's completely different to the count controlled loop, where it's up here, and it's completely different to the while loop, which is also up there. It's at the top of the block of code. So the do until loop is actually unique in the fact that the condition is evaluated at the bottom of the block of code. So what's the implications of that? Well, the implications are that if you are not evaluating the true or false condition, okay, until the bottom of the block of code, it means that that block of code will execute or iterate at least once, if not more. Okay, so it doesn't really matter. Well, it does matter, but if we've iterated once and then the and then the evaluation is done at the bottom of the block of code, okay, it means that iteration is already executed once before Python gets to the point, or a programming language gets to the point, where that condition needs to be evaluated. Okay guys, so whilst you need to be aware of 3 different types of loop for your GCSE computer science, Python does not have the do until loop built into it as a feature that you can use. Okay, it's not available in Python. Python only gives you the choice of 2 loops, which is the count controlled loop and the while loop. All right, now that sort of makes life a little bit easier for 2 reasons. Firstly, because that's less syntax for you to have to remember, but actually also because in reality there is nothing that you can do with a do until loop that you can't actually do with the while loop. So to a certain degree, the do until loop is a nice to have because it's nicely structured, but actually it's also a little bit redundant as well, because we can create the same solution using a while loop. And I suspect that's one of the reasons why the Python developers left it out of the arsenal of tools which you guys are normally able to access in Python programming. Okay, so just to summarize, guys, there are 3 types of loop you need to know for your GCSE. Okay, one type is called the count controlled loop, all right, which is the one that begins with 4. And the other type of loop, there are 2 examples of these types of loops. These are the condition controlled loops. One example is the while loop, and the other example of the condition controlled loop is the do until loop, which is not available in Python. Okay, and as you've already gathered, guys, okay, the do until loop actually comes in a variety of different names. You'll see on the internet and in books it's also referred to as the do while loop or the repeat until loop, but the term that you need to know for OCR is the do until loop. So before I move on, guys, you've probably gathered that the reason I put up a slide with pseudocode on it, which I never normally do in a video, is because we don't have a Python example of do until, because it doesn't exist. I thought it would be easier to compare these 3 types of loop with a standard format, which the pseudocode lends itself to very well. So obviously going forward, you've seen an example of the while loop in the previous video as well, and going forward you will see some examples of the count controlled loop or the for loop as well. So that just begs the question, under what circumstances do we use these different types of loops then? So as a summary, what we could say is that for the count controlled loop, these loops are used when we want, so that's us as programmers, want to be specific about how many times we want to iterate, and to be able to do that from the outset. Okay, so if we ask our program to loop 10 times, then that's what we expect to happen when the program is run. Now there are occasions where we might want to break out of a loop early and not complete the full count, but for the most part, if we are going to hard code a requirement to print X number of times, then that is what we want to happen. The problem that we've got with that is that there are circumstances where we simply don't know in advance how many times we need to iterate. So that's why it says on the right hand side then that condition controlled loops, okay, so that's our while loop and our do until loop, these are loops that are used when we are unsure of when the condition will actually change from true to false. So again, a great example of this was the example program that we did in the last video, where we left it to the user to decide how often to iterate in order for the user to give us a number that we could do the maths on. So the user could have chosen to iterate 10 times and give us 10 numbers, or twice to give us 2 numbers, or 100 times to give us 100 numbers. So then as programmers, we are not in control of how many times the program needs to iterate. The control for that comes from somewhere else. Another example might be if we want to read in the lines of text from a text file. We don't know in advance whether that text file has got 2 lines of text in it or 100 lines of text. So if we want to iterate from the beginning of the file to the end of the file, we don't know whether that's going to include 2 iterations or several hundred iterations. Okay, so we need conditions and a structure for certain types of loop that will cater for that type of uncertainty. Okay guys, so that's all I wanted to cover in this video. I wanted to make sure that we got the technical terms that are used by OCR so that you're aware of what those are and that you know how to apply those as well. And just to give you a heads up that the OCR technical terms are not the only ones you may come across. So to avoid confusion, you'll now know what types of other terms are applied to the similar type of terminology given to you by OCR. Okay, so just by way of summary guys, please remember there are 3 types of loop you need to be aware of. Only 2 of those are available in Python. The for loop is referred to by OCR as the count controlled loop, okay, and the other types of loop, that's the while loop and the do until loop, are formally referred to as condition controlled loops, and it is the do until loop which is not available to us in Python, but you still need to know that it exists and that other programming languages can provide that for programmers. Okay guys, I will see you in the next video where we will start to do a few more examples both of while loops and of count controlled loops as well.